despite the kind of colourful language of Revelation, it does paint a very clear picture that this is an enemy that is much smaller and much more limited than God. It's not good versus evil. We don't know who's going to win. It's actually evil has been conquered. It's still pretty furious and ferocious, but actually the end story is of the victory of God's goodness over evil.
Welcome to this week's Calling Us Into Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in Glasgow. I mean, it is still the morning, but the whole clocks change thing's still going for me, so I don't know. Any stories of clock change disasters this week? Iain, you were preaching. Is it one of these things? I always end up like doing something at church when the clocks go the other way around, and it's like, why did I not notice that I committed to doing something, which maybe means I'm here an hour earlier? Was it nice having an extra hour?
Yeah, an extra hour is always a good thing, but it's the spring's the one you've really got to watch for when you lose that extra hour right at the last minute, especially if you're doing some last minute preparation on a Saturday evening, and you lose a whole hour.
Have you never thought to just look at the calendar and go, yeah, we'll put Brodie in for preaching that week so he loses the hour? Ever done a sneaky?
No, I don't know where this rumour is developing from, that I'm giving Brodie the hard passages and that I'm kind of giving him the hard weekends to do. No, I'm not that clever.
I think it's been spread by Brodie, is it not? Brodie, good morning.
Good morning. No,
Are you the source of these rumours?
I'm not spreading any rumours.
I think it's just you, Richard.
it's just. No, on Sunday I was speaking to some younger parents who did not benefit from the extra hour because their kids were, so they effectively lost an hour somewhere. So it's not a win for everybody.
Yeah, I have to agree with this. As people with animals, and also because we currently have a puppy, they are not aware of the clock change. They just think you're late. They're annoyed. They're willing to tell you they're annoyed. My frustration is also that whilst you might gain the hour in the morning, I get to bedtime, I'm still struggling. Get to sort of 9 o'clock and I'm like, I need my bed. Because I think it's 10 o'clock and not 9 o'clock. So takes a wee minute for me. I'm getting old.
We'll not get into discussions about should we keep all this time change nonsense. That's for a different day, entirely different podcast.
That is a different podcast.
That's the Old Men Shed podcast. Right. This week, Iain, we had your good self. Care to give us a summary of where you got to in the book of Revelation?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I do want to give a summary of Revelation 12 and 13. But I think maybe just a rough guide is these are passages which really reinforce the biblical narrative conviction that our world is just from at a very deep level engaged in a spiritual conflict, that we need to be alert to that and that we need to respond with the supernatural gifts that are given to us by God. The supernatural conflict is described as in the form of a dragon, but that dragon, we need to recall and remember, is not all present and not all powerful, and in fact is already defeated. Despite that, we face its effects, we face ongoing spiritual challenges, but we are to take heart and we are to have confidence in God, who has already overcome the forces of evil. That's my first dig at it.
So straight out the gate, I'm going to make no apology for the fact that I've been getting a lot of help recently from the good people at Bible Project. And I think for some people, we get to these chapters and they're a bit freaked out because we've got dragons and beasts. And we get a bit uncomfortable, but the reality is that the Bible is full of, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation, the mention of beasts and dragons in various forms. And I think it's helpful for us, and you were saying this to us on Sunday about getting our weirdness back and kind of re-embracing the understanding of what's happening in the supernatural in this way, that these creatures are mythical creatures which have in fact been used for millennia to talk about chaos and death. And that obviously creation was bringing life out of the chaos, but these creatures are trying to take us back into the chaos. They're creatures of anti-creation. And it's not scary for us to think about dragons once we understand that they're being used in that representative way. And why do you think we find it uncomfortable to read about dragons in scripture like that and kind of go, oh, hold on, it's just you're making my life weird now. I don't know how to deal with this.
I guess, we all like to buy into the illusion of control of a world that we can measure and manage. And then when you start introducing other forces that we're not really aware of or not really able to comprehend, it is fearful, because you get to the stage of thinking, well, I thought I kind of knew what I was working with, but here are all these other things that are around. But of course, really for pretty much all of the biblical history, the idea that there were these sort of mythical monsters or whatever was quite widely held, and so Revelation is just really falling back on imagery and symbolism that people would really have in the main been able to identify to one degree or another, or at least identify with, not necessarily kind of pinpoint what they were. But yeah, so I think it comes right through from Genesis 1 right through to where we are in Revelation. Yeah.
I think as well there's a danger of, if we're not fearful of them, then if we've grown up with kind of, or caught somewhere, the idea that Revelation's a book to be decoded, then we then kind of like are sitting trying to work out, oh, do these heads represent different people? And, getting scared by Newsnight and trying to kind of like, oh, that must be that head and all that sort of stuff. And we become so obsessed with kind of like allegorical specificity that we miss the theological truths that are behind these. These are images that are meant to reveal a truth to us, not necessarily a specificity about a world event that has happened or is happening. So the truth, as Iain says, is we're in a battle. We know what happens. We know who wins. So while we're not promised ease or comfort, we have a security in that we know who the victor is.
Well, first of all, Brodie, congratulations on saying the word specificity without stumbling over it twice, because as you can see, I have no chance. You're talking about supernatural conflict, and you mentioned about, not trying to be specific about looking at, who fits into these things and these descriptions of, characters and people, is X, Y, and Z actually the European Union or China or Iran or whatever? But at the same, and then there's a personal element to that, which comes from these kind of books, not books of old, kind of 80s, 90s, kind of Frank Peretti, this present, that, all that kind of stuff, that has influenced how we view spiritual warfare. So how do you think that these battles and this struggle that is described actually works in the unseen places, the unseen realms that are beyond our plane of existence as we see around us? I'm trying not to channel Friday's transforming event with physics and theology, but I'm curious as to, well, how does this stuff actually happen around us? What's actually going on when we talk about spiritual warfare? We're having the descriptions of angels, demons, dragons, battles, war. How does it actually cross over to what we experience?
Well, I'll take a bash at that, and then Brodie can give us the right answer. I think I kind of tried to pull out that there were two channels that the beasts kind of represented in very general terms. One was power and one was propaganda. So just taking power or influence, I think one of the ways that I kind of would see it would be that there's a power in spiritual influence that's sort of kind of very generalized force. So take, for example, that you participate in something which is ungodly, something which is moving away from God, which is anti-creation, if you like. When you do that, you are engaging with an influence that amplifies and maybe habitualizes what you are engaged in. So it becomes almost like a spiritual force, or like the kind of spiritual wind at your back that reinforces a direction of travel against God. So if it's an addiction, it's something that then becomes a kind of spiritual influence that makes that more compulsive and that locks that more in. So something that kind of amplifies and something that reinforces and almost like catches people, and takes them away. I mean, you kind of see that, where there's just these kind of brutal social genocides or some kind of movement of people that takes on a kind of death cult mentality. And it's not that people have sat around and thought, this is a nice idea. It actually kind of carries a momentum of its own. So I would suggest that would be a way in which demonic power influences people, by kind of reinforcing something that is already a vulnerability. And then I think the second one is the whole kind of propaganda thing, which is about deception. And that's all. Now, don't ask me how that mechanism works, but we are, conscious of all sorts of influences that are upon us, that kind of permeate our minds. So, the whole thing of mistruth, untruth, being deceived, believing things that are wrong, and again, that just sort of being reinforced by some kind of demonic influence. I suppose these are kind of, so they're maybe based in ideologies and thinking and viewpoints that just seem to have a grip on humanity, and we kind of pick that up.
Where does that Tozer quote you used, thinking of it as the world as a playground, not a battleground? How does that kind of work into that?
Well, I think there's something about, I was really trying to say that I think the first stage in this for all of us is really to change something of our worldview, because I think we have often a perspective which is really just simply pertains to what can be measured. I mean, it's almost, I don't want to get back into the physics thing of Friday night, but actually there's a weirdness in physics, but most of us really just get as far as sort of Newtonian physics, what we can measure, what we can count, what's within our eye line, but actually there's something far more than that, and I think it's the same spiritually. I think we can understand our own personal feelings, but to actually see that we're in an environment which is broader and wider and has a spiritual dimension to it is actually something that's quite difficult. And I think it's quite nice for us. I think it's quite acceptable to kind of believe that these things are, they're off the chart. They're not really something for us to consider. They're not really something to take into account when we look at the world or our own lives. So there's an unpleasantness about viewing this, and it can be regarded as not being a particularly nice thing. So I think to kind of regard the world as simply a playground or something that we can comprehend and control is much more acceptable than recognizing that there are chaotic forces of evil around. So I think it's easier not to deal with it, to kind of stay away from the weirdness.
I think as well, when we get into this kind of thing, there's balance is the wrong word, but we need to hold a couple of things together, or kind of like have double vision in some respects of, we're in a battle and we mustn't lose sight that we're in a battle, and that God has equipped us, but has subverted as well our idea of how a battle is fought and won. And I think it's important to say that the book of Revelation is deeply, deeply anti-militaristic, and yet it's full of battles. So we can't, so there's a subversion of of that. But it's a revelation of Jesus. And therefore, our starting point, our be thou my vision, is Jesus. I remember back when I was an older teen of kind of like, and it would have been around the time of the Frank Peretti stuff and things like that. Some folk I knew just got almost obsessive about kind of like the demonic and things like that. And they were in danger of losing sight of Jesus and danger of losing the sight that Jesus had won. We need discernment. So if my car doesn't start in the morning, it's not necessarily a demon trying to frustrate me and stop me getting to an important appointment. It's I forgot to put it in for a service, or it's run out of fuel or something like that. But there are at times things that happen that we sense are a spiritual attack. So we live in a 4-block built in the 1930s. The thermal and acoustic insulation is like a sieve. And one of our neighbours, late at night and early in the morning, likes to phone her son, and the profanities, the ripping this poor boy to shreds, it would make anybody blush. And we were going to sleep with this dialogue in our heads. And Alison said, Brodie, this is a spiritual attack. So we took authority over it and it stopped. Now, it started the other morning again, which is a reminder for us of it's a battle that we continually engage in, that we need to re-engage in. So that's kind of like the personal level. I think Iain's already mentioned as well of another big theme in Revelation is deception and mistruth and lies. And therefore it's significant of when we get into chapter 14 and begin in chapter 14, verse 5, we're told that the 144,000, no lie is in their mouth. So at a very basic level, one of the ways that we engage in spiritual warfare is in speaking truth. And as Iain touched on Sunday, of quite often the truths we need to engage with or the battle that we need to engage with are mistruths about ourselves that people have either spoken to us or that our culture has placed upon us. So there's that personal level. There's then the kind of like the systemic level as well, because part of the imagery here is of these weird monsters have authority over the whole earth. And therefore there's a systemic element to this. And a very influential thinker in this era is a guy called Walter Wink. And he talked about naming, unmasking, and engaging the powers. So we need to name what is happening, unmask, that kind of like the injustice that we see isn't just a political ideology, but there's something spiritual behind this and then engage. And that whole engage bit is again a matter of discernment of what does it look to engage with this in the way of the Lamb. And a starter for 10, and that is it looks normally like the opposite of whatever it is that we're engaging with. So where there's hate, we're showing love. Where there's unforgiveness, we are forgiving. Where there's a withholding of resources, we're being generous, is a general rule of thumb of how we do battle. And that spiritual battle often manifests itself in us doing practical, actual, tangible things.
You talked in section 2 when you'd got to chapter 13, Iain, about the fact that all of these battles and so on, that the Lamb has defeated evil, and that they aren't God, they aren't rivals of God. He has defeated them. And I've been really helped in my understanding of this by what Tim Mackey talks about a lot of, is that these are not God's rivals, they are creation's rivals. So the evil, the demonic, the monsters, the sea dragons, the whatever, they aren't equal to God. And I think sometimes I'm guilty of feeling like the battle that is happening, that that God's won, but you're still feeling like God is having to somehow flex or put effort in relation to what's happening. But the reality is that it's happening to us within creation. So what is happening on earth is happening to the people that God has made. So I suppose you could argue at that point that it is a fight against God, but it's against what God has made. It is not against God himself. So they are not equal to God. And we do have the confidence to know that the battle is ultimately won and that we are safe and protected, as you also talk about when the woman and the dragon and talks about her children being kept safe.
I mean, what Jack's saying is also pushes into, I can't remember where the quote comes from. I think it's Mere Christianity, but it might be the Screwtape letters, which is about the devil not, you've never been tempted by the devil because he's in one location. As Jack says, he's in creation. He's not up there with God with equal power and authority. So he's not like coming and knocking on your door or in control of everything. That's not how it works. First of all, can anyone remember whether it's Mere Christianity or the Screwtape letters?
I know that in Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis talks about there's two dangers that we can have with the devil. One is to kind of like make him a cartoon character of, red with a pitchfork. I'm trying to remember the name of the Didi from the Tour de France. If you don't know who Callum knows who Didi from the Tour de France is, of a character like that. Or to think, do you know what, the devil's stalking me kind of thing. Those are the two dangers. And it's I don't want to use the word balance because balance sounds like kind of like some compromise or third way. But as Iain said, the devil is not, or Satan is not, doesn't have unlimited power, doesn't know everything, can't be everywhere. He delegates this authority that he has to these other monsters, to the beasts, which are really a parody of God's character. So I think it's probably Mere Christianity, which is it's a long time since I read it, but it's a good book. But I think it is really hard for us, given particularly the cultural moment that we live in. And if, like me, you like your sci-fi movies and things like that, very often the image that we're presented is of this dualistic battle between good and evil, and a good actually struggles to overcome evil, or there's just such a terrible cost. And that's not the picture that we get in Revelation at all. In fact, when the battle in heaven, God's not even involved. It's Michael, So God's like, this is below my, well, not quite below my pay grade.
Below my pay grade.
But he's not directly involved. But the Lamb is. The Lamb has won, but the Lamb has won by, as it were, not even engaging directly in battle, by just kind of like totally changing the rules. Not changing the rules, but kind of like, yeah, through his sacrificial death, he has won. So again, Revelation rewrites or retells or tells us the deeper truth of what actually being a conqueror and being victorious is. It doesn't look like what the beast and the dragon tell us. And one of the big challenges that we have in and out with the church is the whole myth of redemptive violence. And Revelation, the Bible, tells a different truth.
Are we guilty? Well, we are. We're guilty of overinflating the power of all that is evil and underestimating the power of God.
Absolutely, but I think the other side of it is, and without getting into the whole issue of suffering, when we look at our world, and you don't have to look very far, sadly, these days, you do see rampant evil, anti-creation, the destruction of human life on a horrific scale, and people ask that the question, how on earth, literally, can that happen? And I think you do have to factor in that there are superhuman forces at work. But I think it's important, just as you very clearly put it, Jackie, that there's a limitation. There's both a physical limitation to the power of the enemy, and there is a temporal limitation, that his time is short. And I think part of it is that we also, just really speaking to what Brodie said about the kind of Star Wars idea of good and evil, and I think we need to be careful in our language, and I think oftentimes we're very lax, in how we talk about Satan. Satan tempted me. Well, I doubt Satan tempted you, any of us in the room. We're not that important. I'm really sorry, but we're not. The kind of the core of evil is still limited in location and in time, and we need to be maybe more precise in our language about this, because we can actually give the enemy a higher position and a greater sense of power by the language that we use and the way that we talk about enemy activity and power. So just maybe a shout out to, let's be careful about our language in all of this, and how we talk about this, because despite the kind of colourful language of Revelation, it does paint a very clear picture that this is an enemy that is much smaller and much more limited than God. This is not good versus evil. We don't know who's going to win. It's actually, evil has been conquered. It's still pretty furious and ferocious, but actually the end story is of the victory of God's goodness over evil. And it's also, and talking about the Lamb, it's the weakness of God that is actually stronger than the power of the enemy. It's not that God has had to exercise the full expression of his might. It's actually that God has laid down the weakness of his Son to win the victory. That's the disparity between the powers.
And when Richard was talking earlier about just what is happening in the spiritual realm, there's that awareness for us, which I always think is helpful, that we can be partnering with at any given point that which is not good, that which is not helpful to our lives. And you were referencing, obviously, ungodly beliefs and inner vows, strongholds, footholds, all thoughts and our everyday thoughts and language, the things that we are coming into agreement with, that becomes landing sites, that becomes places where all the demonic things that are around about us can just take that hold. And I think there was an interesting reference, not that you had said on Sunday, but in something else, that was talking about when Jesus is telling his disciples that he is going to be crucified, and Peter comes to him and says, no. And he then says, "Get behind me, Satan." There's that reality that in our words and actions and deeds and thoughts and so on, we can take on the work of the snake, the dragon, the whomever at any given point. And it is the helpful part I find about these chapters is in the remembering and the thinking at any given point that whilst sitting in a room quietly with my own thoughts, it might feel all peaceful, and if God is there with me, which he is, then it absolutely can be. But if I start to partner with thoughts that are other than him, thoughts that are not from God, then you're absolutely in the middle of battles in our day-to-day mundane life. And we have the power and authority to subdue said dragons by our responses in any given moment. And I think it just highlights to us there is responsibility for us in this, right? Like, we have responsibility and authority in the ways that we are interacting with the things happening around us at any given point on any given day.
I think one of the very simplistic ways I think about it is that the kind of demonic power of evil is like spiritual vermin. It's like a kind of spiritual virus. And if you put rubbish out, you get rats. And if you produce rubbish and you leave it lying around, you get spiritual rats. And I think, that can be dealt with. It's not that is an overwhelming issue, but the bottom line is deal with the rubbish and ensure that you're not that you're minimizing the rubbish in your life, and you're dealing with the rubbish that's gathering in your life. And I think that would be the first place, and that's at the level of our thinking, our relating to God, our prayer life, those kinds of things. When that those are the mechanisms by which we stay right with God, we stay in relationship with God, we keep the rubbish away.
Yeah. And Brodie, it's not that we then need to live fearfully, it's just that we need to live responsibly and aware.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the dangers in all of this, of people start to be fearful. The good news is that Jesus has come to set us free, and that we are equipped and enabled to walk in that freedom. But as the writer to Hebrews reminds us of, it's easy to get entangled and pick up stuff that we shouldn't, and therefore we all regularly need to do kind of like a spiritual health check. In some respects, the church has a natural mechanism for that, and that's coming around the Lord's table, where we're not only looking internally about, can I bring my life to this table, to this holy moment, to this holy person? What doesn't belong here? Oh, I need to deal with that. But also in my relations externally, of, is there something with my brother or sister that I need to work on and resolve? So we have built into the rhythm of church life a very natural point in which we have that look to say, is there stuff that I need to deal with? And at QP, most Sundays, every Sunday perhaps, at the end of the service, there's a time of response, which again is that reflexive moment of what's God saying to us. Is there stuff that we need to deal with? And I think one of the challenges is, or a truth is, that if we think, oh, I'll deal with that later, chances are later never comes. It's like, the email that I'll red flag that and deal with it. And, 3 weeks later, Jackie, did you get that email I sent you? Because, that's, as human beings, we have lots of stuff going on and we're not great at. So I'm doing a shout out for, if God speaks to you on a Sunday, or the Spirit highlights something, of deal with it then. There's the prayer corner with wonderful people like yourself, Jackie, who love to stand. The prayer corner is confidential. What happens there isn't spoken about elsewhere. It doesn't go outside that space. Even when people are sharing what they want to be prayed for, people close by can't hear because there's too much background noise going on. So it's a safe place with loving, caring, Jesus-following, Spirit-filled people that want to stand with you and can help you bring into that freedom and help do battle with you. So don't put off what God's highlighting today. But at the same time, having said all of that, there are some things in our lives which have layers to them. And one of the tactics that the enemy uses, because we know that lies are the chief weapon of the enemy in some respects, is, see, that going for prayer last week didn't work because you're still having some of those thoughts, or you're still doing this. And the reality is, do you know what? The prayer was effective. There's just deeper stuff to do. There's just more stuff to do. It's a big pile of rubbish, and the way you move a mountain is a spade at a time. So don't fall for the lies. Keep at it. God is good. He calls us into his love and his goodness and his freedom.
Yeah, and I've said this a million times in the podcast, and I'll say it again. God never prompts us with something that he's not prepared to follow through to help us deal with. The Holy Spirit will not bring to mind something that you need to address if he does not also provide you with the tools and the ability to actually resolve it. But there is a part for all of us to play in being willing to and the saying yes to the process, because it's not always comfortable.
And I think there's probably something that's worth just kind of saying in addition to that is that when God prompts something, it's not towards condemnation, it's towards liberation. And I think when the enemy brings something up, and one of the things that the enemy does is accusation, which is condemnatory and which is destructive. And I think one of the tasks of the enemy is to paralyze Christians and to stop us from getting into that place of freedom. So actually, when it's God, it's good. And if God is convicting us of something, it's not so that we will get stuck in this place of condemnation and accusation and just kind of mental self-harm, but actually it's there to rip up something that's actually inhibiting us from following him. So I think trying to discern, I know that's a bit of a challenge between something that's just an accusation and something that's of God, but if it's an environment where it's coming out of a place where we're worshipping and where God is speaking and it's coming directly from his word, then we can be much more confident that is God speaking and God convicting us. I think when you get in that dark place last thing at night and you're kind of rolling over how terrible you are, that's probably more likely to be the enemy than it is the Lord. So just try and discern between something that's an accusation, and you might need to check that out with somebody else, and something that's convicting, because that leads to freedom.
That maybe leads into a bit of the text that when you preached on it and when I read through it, I was like, I don't understand why the rod or the scepter is an iron scepter. So I went to have a wee look. First of all, does anybody want any guesses as to what? Because I assumed when it's described as an iron scepter, I'm thinking, well, why is it not gold or made with diamonds or crowns or whatever on it? But I had a wee dig. But does anybody want to have a guess or already know why it's an iron scepter? I'm sure there's more than one reason.
No, but we should probably just contextualize it as this is the reference to Psalm 2, which is the messianic psalm that helps to identify the child as being Christ, the Messiah, who comes to rule with a rod or a scepter of iron, which Rich is now going to tell us.
Well, he might be wrong.
I'm going to let I might be wrong, and B, I'm going to let Brodie have a guess first.
Well, so it's not so much a guess. I have some thoughts, but let's hear what you've got to say first.
Okay. Well, I see, because when it's described as a rod, I always think of a rod as being like something you're gonna. Maybe I'm just play Cluedo too often, in the kitchen with the iron rod or the water, but the pipe, this thing. But it appears that it's mostly from the idea that the shepherd's crook was actually made of iron or wood. Most often it was an iron staff crook. And so it is actually to do with the guidance of the sheep. So it's a discipleship tool rather than some sort of lording over thing or some sort of thing to punishment beat you with. It just always struck me the way that it's interpreted. It feels like it's, it almost, when I read it, almost without that background I'm now going away and had a look at, it almost always felt like it was some sort of threat. I'm going to rule over you with an iron rod. Maybe it's those kind of, post First World War black and white movies where it was all kind of iron rods and staffs and conquering and all this kind of thing. Brodie?
I think we also talk about making a rod for our own backs, which is a very negative thing. And I think you're right of, biblically in the hands of God, a rod is something that comforts and brings security. And iron speaks of, it's not wishy-washy. It's not bending, as it were, but it's stable. It's secure. This is someone that we can put our trust in because he's dependable. Gold's a soft metal which is easily bent, but God's comfort, his protection, his shepherding us is secure. And for me, it speaks of a word that we've used a few times, not in this series, but of hesed, that loving, steadfast kindness of God.
The language around it is, which is translated leading or ruling, is actually the word shepherding. So, we are being directed in that direction to see Christ as the Messiah, as a shepherd leading the flock, which does then kind of raise all those allusions, Psalm 23, which Brodie's already alluded to, and others, about how he leads. So he doesn't lead like the beasts, dominating, ruling, coercing. He rules like the shepherd, leading and engaged with the flock. So maybe that's just a way of supporting what you guys have been arguing.
Well, this has hardly been a linear kind of go through of Iain's preach. This is kind of like turning into the joke of Revelation, that we kind of can't go through a sermon in any sort of order. It's just like all of it together all at once.
Everything all at once. Yeah.
I'm having to kind of embrace that.
Maybe that should have been the sermon title: Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
All at once.
In layers.
But I do want to mention the wondrous woman, because Iain, as a title for a section, well, I just like the wondrous woman. I suppose my question is kind of, how did she end up being wondrous on your slide? I nearly said acetate there for a minute. Oh my day.
Everybody under 30 is Googling acetate. What's that?
Acetate.
Listen, we for reasons that we'll not go into, we ended up buying a cassette player the other day, and Elliot, our daughter, came in, and I said, "So do you know what this is?" It says, "Yes, I do know what a cassette is." And then she said, "I've just never actually seen one before." So yes, acetate is of a similar vintage.
No, I think just the simple reason was, I'm just looking around at some translations to see some of the translations. Even the NIV says a great and wondrous sign.
Wondrous woman.
So that's why the woman was wondrous.
Wondrous.
Because it's a wondrous sign. I think it's actually, he said, having a quick look at his text here, I think it's actually a great sign is probably the more direct translation.
I mean, wondrous is pretty good. I like it.
Yeah. Well, in Greek it's a mega sign, so you can either go for wondrous or mega.
Goodness. I think what I am enjoying so much about Revelation, and I hear that lots of other people are enjoying Revelation as well at the moment, so well done, guys. What I'm enjoying so much about it is all of the references, that sort of when you have this sort of scriptural awareness and you see what's being referenced, like this chapter, you're seeing some Genesis things, and then we've already referenced when you're seeing Zechariah and so on, and all the different places, and it sort of just feels like God's taking you on a treasure hunt. And I think I very much felt in my own heart that sense of, sometimes we want everything to be all at once, just in our understanding. We would like, just, can you just tell me exactly how it is, so I don't have to do any work for it, so that I don't have to think about it? Why can't this just be plain spoken so I know what you're meaning? There's so much richness in the layers of all of these things, and it calls us into so much relationship with God, because we are trusting in him, learning to see that his mind is not like our mind, and that he is so much greater than we are. And there's just something wonderful about that surrender of not always knowing all the time, and having to accept that we're limited in our understanding, but yet trusting him, and then at times seeing the revelation of something that you didn't understand before, and all the richness that brings just in how we relate to and understand and love our Father. Or is this just my experience at the moment?
I think it is very rich, isn't it? I mean, there's just so much, even subtle allusion that references back to so many different things. And even thinking about the woman, I mean, the woman is this kind of shape-shifting symbol that gathers together I mean, some people would suggest it even begins with Eve. There's a reference in this to Eve, a reference to Israel as the kind of mother of salvation. There's a reference to Mary, and then there's a reference really that that this woman is the kind of mother of the church and has offspring. So, I mean, even this character references the whole sweep of scripture. So I think one of the things you can do with Revelation is begin to dive into some of these rabbit holes and, you know, trace them all the way back. But it, like a lot of the New Testament, there's just this deeply, richly embedded reference and allusion to the whole of the Old Testament, which is why we need to read the whole Old Testament, because you can't understand the New Testament if you just kind of are picking out words and then, you know, thinking, well, how does that relate to today's world? Well, you have to actually work out that, you know, the rod of iron or whatever is a reference to Psalm 2, which, you know, is, and then once you kind of go into it, it's almost like there's a signpost, and once you go to the signpost, you sit in the field that the signpost has signed you to, and in that field there's so much more information. So some of these things are just like little flags, and they flag up a whole text or a whole story that gives you more light into what you're actually reading.
Well, no reading of Revelation 12 and 13 would be complete without touching on 666. So just as you did towards the end of the sermon, this is probably one of the most cultural crossing from the Bible into popular culture that exists. So as a starter for 10, Iain, tell us a little bit about 666 or 616 as some may have it, depending whether you put an S on the end of Nero, I think was where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can just, there's maybe a whole podcast for somebody to do on all of this. I mean, there are probably just a couple of main ways of looking at it. The one is that it is, I think it's gematria that they kind of call it. It's using the Greek letters to be numbers, which is what the Greeks did, and then you can count that up, and you can get everything with that. You can get Martin Luther, you can get Napoleon, you can get Stalin, you can get Hitler, Henry Kissinger, and Ronald Reagan. I think are just some of the names that you can actually get by using 666. So there's a bit of, you know, you can squeeze this into anything, though probably the most common, certainly if you're looking at the time, would be the horrendous Emperor Nero, and it's possible that a lot of the references in Revelation are kind of hidden critiques of Nero. So that's not too maybe too far off, but also, yeah, I think you can also calculate it to spell out beast as well in Greek. So it may just be as simple as saying 666 is just beast, which is described earlier on in the passage as well. So that's the first one, is to kind of use the numbers. And then, I mean, there are one or two other more kind of exotic ways of looking at it. And the other one is just to simply treat 666 as a symbol rather than a code. And if you look at 1318, it talks about, like, the one who has understanding, calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man. So it's basically, this is symbolizing humanity in some kind of way. And it could be that John is kind of saying, well, whilst there's a supernatural evil, it has a human manifestation, and it has a human number. So it's 666. And within that, 6 is the number biblically of incompleteness, of falling short. And 7 is the number of completion. You have the sevenfold Spirit, God's perfection at the beginning of Revelation. And 666, well, it could be completely incomplete. It's like, it doesn't get much more incomplete than this. So I think there's that kind of symbolism of it. And I think for me, just particularly this Sunday, just thinking about the way in which the reach of the dragon always fell short. And the whole story is about the dragon not having sufficient authority or power to destroy the child, not having sufficient power to destroy the woman, not having sufficient reach to overtake the offspring of the woman, the Church of Christ. So for me, it just really, in this particular occasion, I'm sure we could look at other ways, but it just really stood out for me that this is actually all about, or partly about, the enemy being insufficient and unable to do what he purports to do and what he threatens to do. And I just found that really, on this particular occasion, reading this particular text, for me, that was just really encouraging, that 666 is not a threatening, evil statement of ultimate power. It's God saying, the enemy's not sufficient. The enemy can't overrun you. The enemy can't get to you. The enemy can't reach as far as you are. It's always short. It's always short. The Spirit is 777. The Spirit is the fullness, completeness, and actually the enemy's reach doesn't reach as far as where you are in Christ.
Mm-hmm. Well, the good news is, because obviously someone's developed an online tool to establish as to whether there's any way of adding up your respective names to equal 666. You'll be pleased to know that none of our names can be made in any way to equal 666. So it ain't us is the main thing. Brodie, any thoughts on the numerology of all of this?
I think Iain's spot on what he says. There is, interestingly, a technical word for the fear of the number 666.
Oh, right. Okay.
No.
Well,
There is. So it is hexakosioihexekontahexaphobia.
that's your cultural reference for the week.
Cultural reference for the week. So the technical word for the fear of the number 666 is hexakosioihexekontahexaphobia. If I pronounced that correctly.
Click your heels 3 times, you appear in Narnia. Is that?
Yeah. But I think as you're right, it's that cultural reference that has got over, and people get a bit kind of like heebie-jeebie about it or whatever. But even with the beasts and the dragons are a distortion of God's character, and here this number is a distortion of God's character. Even kind of like one of the heads of the beast has a wound that looks as though it was slain, but it's still alive. And there was this rumour at the time of maybe Nero wasn't actually dead and he was coming back. But the language that John uses to describe that is a parody of 5:6, which talks about the lamb being slain, looking as though it had been slain. So this is all kind of like, as Iain said, it's saying, do you know what? The enemy is trying to be God, but can't, because it's just insufficient, and therefore what the enemy can do for us, instead of bringing life, brings destruction and brings incompleteness.
Let's bring this show in for a landing. So let's get some cultural references for a wee start, and then we'll give everyone their final words. Who wants to go first? Any volunteers?
I feel seen and affirmed on culture.
All right, okay.
So I think it was on the Saturday morning with Professor David Wilkinson. Iain asked a question about science fiction, and he revealed that he enjoys Star Wars and Star Trek, and as somebody who, kind of like having watched Ashoka, is trying to fill in the gaps in my Star Wars lore, and is currently working his way through what on the surface of it are kids' cartoons.
Yes, they are.
But tell you what, there's a lot of spirituality and goodness knows what in these cartoons.
Well,
of you like,
yes.
What's that all saying? Anyway, I feel seen by David Wilkinson and
Good stuff.
Watching. It's not very high culture, but it's culture nevertheless.
Yes, because the Star Wars lore is about to take a bit of a Trinitarian turn into the future. So we can watch out for everyone looking at Star Wars for Trinitarian metaphors in the next 3 to 5 years. Iain?
Not very much of a cultural week for me, but just maybe off the back of what Brodie said, I think David Wilkinson has actually written some material about science fiction. So if people are chasing that down, our science fiction fans can go and have a look at some of his reflections on science fiction. To be honest, I kind of knew he would have that response because I've actually been to a lecture on science fiction that he did some years ago. But I've forgotten all of that. I've forgotten all my science fiction, and I'll leave that to you guys to build up on all of that.
We can have a watch party of the 9 films of Star Wars sometime. Jack, will you be joining us for that?
No.
We did do
No,
the
no.
whole Marvel movies in order during
Yeah,
lockdown.
I think I slept a lot of it, but that's okay.
Give us your thoughts, your reference this week.
And no shock here, more worship music for people. So Iain mentioned a little while ago, I'm sure it was Iain, that talking about more locally sourced worship music and the value of it, or just generally being more sort of cultural, a more wider variety in our cultural worship music. So Central Church in Edinburgh, however many miles away that is, I think just 50 something, have released an album last Friday, and it's called Have Faith Live at Central Hall. I know about it because my nephew goes there, and I have to say it is a great album. Tracks 2 and 7 I particularly highlight for your enjoyment. Really good.
Stuff. Great. My brief cultural reference for the week is actually the Screwtape letters and Mere Christianity, because I had cause to reflick through them as part of this, and they are such enjoyable little books to read, so go and check them out. Also, Brodie has now typed in the fear of 666, and it looks like a place name in Wales when you see it typed down. So we can go and check that out. We'll get that put in the show notes for those that are interested. So Laura, that's doing the show notes, can go and try and figure this out, and she can have the job of retyping it in. Okay, let's close us up. Brodie, final thought for the...
We're in a battle, engage in the battle, but don't be fearful. Jesus has won.
Good one. Jack?
Yeah, how can you disagree with that? It's brilliant. Also, just shout out, also highlight that it's really worth giving a listen to the Chaos Dragon series of podcasts that the Bible Project do, because it's so helpful, and it just demystifies and gives you, as Brodie has already said, the confidence not to fear, because we know that God is victorious and cannot be overcome.
Good stuff. And Iain, you preached it, so final word to you.
Well, I can't do better than Revelation. So they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death.
And on that note, have a great week. See you again next week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.